I'm delighted to welcome Darian Leader, who is a psychoanalyst working in London, a member of CFAR and the College of Psychoanalysts UK. He's the author of several books, including Introducing Lacan, Why Do Women Write More Letters Than They Post?, Freud's Footnotes, Stealing the Mona Lisa, What Art Stops Us From Seeing, Why Do People Get Ill with David Caulfield, The New Black, Mourning, Melancholia and Depression, and What is Madness? His most recent book is Strictly Bipolar, and he's got a new book coming out in June called Hands. As a member of the audience said, you have to know a lot to speak so clearly. The subject today is working with psychosis.
I'd just like to say before I start what important work Ajay and his colleagues, Parveen and the rest of the people who work here are doing. It's remarkable to be able to sustain long-term, open-ended psychotherapy projects open to members of the community with no charge in today's day and age, where therapy services are increasingly automated, tick-boxed, regulated in a way that loses out on the specificity of what individuals might be searching for in therapeutic work. So I think it's fantastic what they're doing. The title I gave this morning was Working with Psychosis. And at one level, what that refers to is simply clinical work with psychotic subjects, working with psychosis from a psychotherapeutic point of view. But we'll see a bit later on how it also has some other meanings which aren't just in the sense of what it means to work clinically with a psychotic subject. Now, before I start to talk about that aspect of working with psychosis, I think it's important to make two basic points about a psychoanalytic approach to psychosis. They both come from old psychiatry, late 19th, early 20th century psychiatry, not the kind of mainstream drug-oriented psychiatry that we have today. Both points are particularly important for thinking about any kind of approach to psychosis, whether it's social, cultural, or clinical. And the first of these points, it's very, very simple, is that there's a difference between going psychotic and being psychotic. It's absolutely crucial. The media, as many studies have shown over the years, always focus, when they refer to psychosis, it's almost invariably, it's between about 70 and 80% of media coverage, it links psychosis with violence or extravagant, supposedly antisocial behavior. Now, obviously, the more that kind of stuff is in the press, on TV, in movies, the more that creates a culture where violent, extravagant, antisocial behavior becomes precisely what we expect from psychosis. To such an extent that in one of the studies in America I read, where an anthropologist went to medical school and followed medical students through to their careers as doctors and psychiatrists, and was looking at what shaped their attitudes to so-called mental health, they reported one particularly striking and telling vignette of a young psychiatrist working with a psychotic subject. And he said, but this patient can't be psychotic because they're well dressed and they're well groomed and they've got their makeup on and they've managed to be married. It's quite extraordinary. You see that the prejudice there, that beneath the no doubt well-meaning comments of the psychiatrist, there's the idea that to be psychotic, one has to be frothing at the mouth or attacking people at bus stops or generally engaging in violent, antisocial, extravagant behavior. In the work of the early psychiatrists, this is totally rejected. Rather, there's the idea that the most common forms of psychosis are those which hardly ever, if at all, will generate any kind of noticeable behavior, things that would go against social norms. Sometimes, for some people, there can be triggering events linked to many different things, which can cause a psychosis to trigger, and in many cases that will be noticeable to others around the person, and in many cases it won't. It can be very discreet, hardly noticeable. But crucial, once we recognize the distinction between being psychotic and going psychotic, having a psychosis triggered, we can then think about what has allowed the person who is psychotic, who hasn't become psychotic, who hasn't triggered their psychosis, what has allowed them to maintain an equilibrium and a stability in their life. And we can hopefully learn from that when we then come to work with subjects who've been less fortunate. I always think of the story told by Eugen Bleuler, one of the first psychoanalytic psychiatrists, of a patient who came into his clinic, was sent to his clinic by their local services just after her 50th birthday. She'd never come to the attention of doctors or psychiatrists before. She'd led a perfectly regular, normal life in the community, getting on with things. Just after her 50th birthday, she'd walked into a bank and asked them to give her 20,000 francs, Swiss francs. The bank didn't know what on earth she was talking about. She didn't even have an account there. And it turned out that 30 years previously, on the eve of her 20th birthday, she'd suddenly developed the delusional thought that if she could retain her virginity until she was 50, she would receive 20,000 francs. So you've got to ask the question, what happened during those 30 years? This was someone who clearly had a delusional thought that was structuring her life, yet it didn't generate any strange or violent or extravagant or antisocial behavior. She just continued like everyone else and was only brought to the attention of services at that point 30 years later. If one were able to study what sustained her during those 30 years, hopefully one could learn from that about how to work with other subjects who perhaps have been less able to find the stability and the equilibrium that she found. So first point, the difference between being psychotic and going psychotic. The second point, and this I think is probably the most fundamental and the most simple point for any approach to psychosis, whether it's psychotherapeutic or pharmaceutical. If someone is waiting on a tube platform and they suddenly hear a voice telling them to jump in front of the train and they've never heard a voice before, or if they're walking in the street and they suddenly feel that their body is about to shatter into 1,000 pieces and nothing has ever happened like that to them before, they've had no comparable experiences, you can obviously imagine the sense of vertigo and terror that that would induce in the person. Now, what would happen if 6 months, maybe a year later, after the person first heard the voice telling them to jump in front of the train, they've devised a theory that actually that voice was transmitted by a microphone that was hidden in the tube station, and the voice had been sent there, transmitted through the technology that we have everywhere around us today, by a certain organization which had some negative intentions towards him. Or in the second case, what if the person gradually, in order to counter this terror of their body shattering into 1,000 pieces, decided to wrap their body in cling film round and round and round again to stop their body from fragmenting and shattering? Now, if we then encountered that person in the setting of a service, we might think that the psychosis is embodied in the fact that this person has a theory that there is a plot against them transmitted through microphones in the underground from an evil agency, or that they've wrapped their body in cling film, and that these are obviously delusional psychotic activities. But the crucial point made by Bleuler and the early psychiatrists who worked with him is that we have to recognize that there's a difference between primary and secondary phenomena in psychosis. The primary phenomena would be the initial moment when the person hears the voice telling them to jump in front of the train, or the initial moment when the person feels their body is about to shatter into 1,000 pieces. And what the person then does next is not in itself psychotic, but rather is a strategy of self-cure. If you feel your body is about to shatter into 1,000 pieces, obviously what you then do next, perfectly rational, you're going to wrap it in some kind of bodily boundary to stop it from happening. So where a casual view would see the idea of the body dissolving and the wrapping the body in cling film as part and parcel of the same thing, the same illness, as it were, what the early psychiatrists showed was that there are two totally different things. That the first is admittedly a psychotic phenomenon, but the second is not a psychotic phenomenon, but an attempt at self-cure. If the person thinks that the voice that told them to jump in front of the train was transmitted by an evil agency using the modern technology, that in itself isn't the psychotic phenomenon. It's an attempt to explain the psychotic phenomenon. It's a rational appeal to the knowledge of the time using what people know in order to explain something. And you see this cross-culturally. In some parts of the world where everyone has mobiles and Wi-Fi, hearing voices is sometimes explained in terms of that kind of electronic transmission. In other parts of the world where these forms of technology are less prevalent, different forms, perhaps linked to spirits, can be more common. What they share is an appeal to rational knowledge to explain or to defend against the initial psychotic phenomenon. And this brings us to the crucial problem today, both in therapeutic and in pharmaceutical approaches to psychosis, that so often we lose the difference between primary and secondary phenomena. The secondary phenomena are seen as in themselves pathological, in themselves ill or sick, rather than respecting them as individual strategies of self-cure that the subject might have spent many years constructing, inventing, and developing. The problem with drugs, and I'm not totally against all uses of medication, but the problem with medication in general is that it doesn't recognize the difference between a primary and a secondary phenomenon. Only a human being in dialogue can do that. You need a space where people talk to each other to be able to grasp that distinction. And crucially, if we then recognize the distinction between primary and secondary phenomena, it nuances our title, Working with Psychosis. It doesn't just mean the clinician, the therapist, the psychiatrist who's working with the psychotic subject. It means the work that the psychotic subject does themselves in building their own delusion or defense or behavior, whatever it is, that allows them, usually before they've met anyone who works in the world of mental health, to survive the initial fragmentation, dissolution, feeling of invasion, things that shatter the person's life. So once you recognize that distinction, is that clear, the distinction between primary and secondary? Once you recognize that distinction, it opens up some radically new perspectives, again, very, very simple ones, it's not complicated, about how one might work with the way that the psychotic subject is already working. So if you encounter the person whose body is wrapped in polythene, you're encountering someone who's already working themselves. They're already doing something as a defense, as a treatment. They're working on their own treatment. And that might give us a clue as to how we could then further or elaborate that treatment. For example, one might work with that subject to help them to develop the practice of perhaps making their own clothes. Yeah? That might be easier in terms of the modern world for that person than to wrap themselves continually in plastic. Yeah? What you'd be doing then, you'd be recognizing the difference between primary and secondary phenomena, learning from what the patient themselves has done, and then trying to elaborate that rather than, for example, telling them that they're unwell because they wrap their body in plastic. On the contrary, it would be taking seriously what the person has done, trying to understand what the latent logic of their own procedure, of their own self-invented treatment has been, and then to move that along the same path, let's say moving from plastic to handmade clothes, for example. Yeah. Take another example, a more famous one, Prince Philip's mother, who was diagnosed with schizophrenia. worried everyone in Buckingham Palace when she developed the belief, the certainty that she was the bride of Christ. And I don't know if you've ever seen the footage of the coronation, there's Philip's mum dressed up in this very strange outfit that again, people were very worried about at the time. And they did all sorts of things of trying to stop her. She'd write letters to the Daily Mail telling them that she was the bride of Christ. They'd try and stop her. So it was a big problem for the royal family and the people who look after them. Now, at one level, you could see her certainty that she was the bride of Christ as a phenomenon of psychosis. Or, when you look at the details, you could see it not as a primary phenomenon, but as a secondary one. Certain very difficult things had happened to her, which made her world collapse. And she subsequently developed the idea, crystallized the idea that she was the bride of Christ. And so rather than that being a problem, for her it was a solution. It gave her a place in the world. So again, a therapy which would try to persuade her that she wasn't the bride of Christ or to undermine the belief would be fundamentally ill-starred and cruel. Rather, it might be a question of acknowledging the person's identificatory position and finding a way in which one could be the bride of Christ that was livable for her, that was maybe fruitful for her, that would make her life more bearable. So this is just, it's such a simple point to recognize the difference between the initial phenomena of psychosis and the work that the psychotic subject does themselves in order to move towards a kind of self-treatment, which we can then learn from in our own therapeutic work as clinicians, some of us, when we work with the psychotic subject. Now, I'm going to say something now about different forms of psychosis and about what this work of psychosis might involve in different groups. Again, it'll sound a bit neat, the way I'm arguing it, but it's for kind of didactic purposes because it's easier when we position things a little bit. So, when we think about the range of different forms of psychosis, and everyone will have different experiences. Lots of people hear voices, but how they hear the voice, where the voice emanates from, how they receive it, how they experience it will be different for different people. Now, when we work with psychotic subjects, when we listen to psychotic subjects, when we read and hear what psychotic subjects have to say about their experience, we tend to find that the work of psychosis, the self-treatments that many psychotic subjects engage in, tend to have three general aims. They tend to fall into three different groups of endeavor, of work. We could say that the first work of psychosis is a work on the question of meaning. It's very, very common at the start of a psychosis that a person, everything might seem normal, and they'll suddenly start to feel that there's meaning in the world. There's some sort of meaning in these paintings. I don't know what it is, but I sense that they mean something, which is perhaps linked to me, but I can't specify it, I can't put my finger on it, I don't really know what it is. Yeah? It's very, very common. Little by little, it might be possible for a meaning to be constructed, like the guy on the tube who heard the voice telling him to jump. He gave a meaning to his experience. He explained it in terms of a plot against him through the microphones and the evil agency. Yeah? That's an appeal to meaning because it gives an explanation or meaning to his experience. Yeah? And we can find across the range of psychoses all sorts of projects to fix or settle meaning. Some are successful, some aren't. I'll give some examples in a moment. The other problem, which you hear about constantly from psychotic subjects, is the problem of bodily agitation, tension, excess, that there's something too much in the body, what psychiatrists used to call morbid excitation, what some psychoanalysts call libido. There's lots of different words for it. It's basically a sense of bodily agitation, anxiety, and urgency, which the subject has to do something about. It might mean, if the person's lucky enough to be able to access a gym, going to a gym for several hours every day. It might mean going running, It might mean harming themselves. It might mean writing. It might be lots and lots of different things that different people invent. But there's a problem of there being something too much in the body, a sense of excess, of bodily excess, which is experienced not in a pleasurable, but in an unpleasurable way. There's something too much in the body. And the person has to find a way to do something about it. Again, I'll give some examples in a moment. The third thing that we often see in the work of psychosis involves the creation of a distance. Well, what is the right distance we should have from each other? And, Ajay kindly mentioned the book that I've written called Hands, which is about why people are always busy doing stuff on their hands. And the more you research this, the more you see that from recorded history, people have always been busy with their hands. They've always had technology to keep their hands busy, electronic or pre-electronic. And what's the function? What is one of the main functions of that technology? It's simply to abstract yourself from your current situation. In contemporary culture, there's a kind of premium on connecting, let's all be together, let's all talk to each other, and so on. But actually, human life has always been just as much about disconnecting as about connecting. It's why we say, let's meet for a coffee instead of let's meet. There always has to be some kind of object to mediate human relations. When people are with each other, they're desperate to look at their email, send a text, update their Facebook page. They're always doing something else. In the playground, the mums and dads are reading the paper or texting or surfing. People are never entirely with other people. And you could say, this is a terrible thing, we've lost the richness of human life, but it's always been like that. If you look at the historical data, it's always been that way. Life is about being with and not being with at the same time. And hence, the necessity of finding ways to create a livable distance from the people that we live with or close to. And you can say that the third main area of work in psychosis is to create a bearable distance. And I remember when automated checkouts were introduced at supermarkets, which for many of my patients was really a blessing, because it meant that they didn't have to exchange the small talk with the cashier. How are you? Are you having a nice day? Yes, fine, thanks. They could just go and check out their stuff and leave, yeah? For some people, that minimal exchange is unbearable. Whereas for other people, for some psychotic subjects, it's actually something nice. They might want that minimal exchange as long as it stays within a certain limit, yeah? It might be important to see the same person serving the tea in a cafe every day, even if you don't talk to them. It might be very important to go and sit on the same park bench and then move somewhere else. And these are, the Canadian psychologist Elaine Corin has done some marvelous work on this, what she calls the solitary geographies of many psychotic subjects who create maps in their environment, in a way, physical, geographical maps, which involve the regulation of distance from other people. So it could involve being very close to people, but it could also involve being very far away from people. But what's crucial is that the subject has got a problem in regulating distance, and hence part of the work of psychosis is to find ways to invent the right distance from others. Yeah? Now, those three areas then, meaning the excess or surplus in the body and the creation of distance, then give us a new perspective on the main groups of psychosis, which from a psychoanalytic perspective fall into three main categories: the schizophrenias, paranoia, and melancholia. Now, if you want to talk about those terms later, we can, but let me just explain a little bit about how those ideas of meaning, bodily excess, and distance are related to those three different categories. Now, you can say that in the schizophrenias, the problem of meaning is open. It's very difficult for a schizophrenic subject to come up with a meaning for the world that stays. Attempts at creating a delusion, which a delusion, after all, is a successful piece of work, because it provides an explanation for what is happening to the person. It's a work of psychosis. Yeah. In schizophrenia, ideas, delusional ideas can emerge, but it's very rare that they have any kind of longevity. They're usually abridged, or they don't last for too long, or they shift into other ideas. And you can see someone, a schizophrenic subject, spending their whole life trying to find meaning for what they're experiencing, and it never quite settles into one thing for them, never into one delusion or one stable sense that would explain what's happening to them in the world. At the level of the excitation in the body, perhaps more than any other group of psychoses, schizophrenic subjects are beset with the problem of this morbid excitation being present in their body. And sometimes a schizophrenic subject will explain it as being sent there by someone else, that they're feeling what someone else has placed inside them or has sent into their body. It's so difficult for many schizophrenic subjects to be able to find a way to empty that out, and hence you often find in the schizophrenias and not in the other psychoses, self-harm, self-cutting, even sometimes in the most extreme cases, mutilation of the body, to try and remove something from the body. And it's why, over the centuries, the therapies which offer to surgically remove something from the body have always been popular. In the 1940s and 50s, there was the idea that psychosis could be helped if you removed bacterial teeth, which is obviously nonsense, but it had a certain success and vogue. Or the removal of the gallbladder was for many years seen as a treatment of choice. Or today, when people say, we've got to remove the toxins from our body. When I tried yoga many years ago, and when I was on my head, the teacher was saying, look, the toxins are leaving your head. In today's day and age, we talk about toxins leaving the body. In the 17th and 16th century, about bloodletting. Every stage of civilization has got its own way of formulating the idea that there's too much in the body and we have to lose something from the body to be well. And you see this as an urgent problem in the schizophrenias, to try and find ways to remove something from the body. Finally, the creation of distance, very, very difficult for many schizophrenics, where the other is always too close or too far away. It could be the partner, the husband, the wife, the child, the therapist, the shopkeeper, it could be anyone. But it's very, very difficult for the person to be able to maintain and create the right distance, because other people are, in a sense, too close. They invade them too much. They can even enter into the person's body. And so it's crucial for the person to make barriers and limits, like the lady with the polythene, wrapping herself in polythene, to stop this invasion from the outside. Now move to paranoia. Again, remember the three motifs: meaning, excess in the body, and distance. Paranoid subject is in a way the most, let's say, successful with these themes, because a paranoid subject has succeeded in giving a meaning to the world. The other is against me. There is a plot against me. The other wants to kill me. Yeah? Generally, a paranoid person is innocent. It's never their fault. It's the neighbor's fault, or the government, or MI5, or whatever it is. There's always a petition between oneself and the other, exactly what you don't find in many cases of schizophrenia. The person has succeeded to resolve the question of meaning. There is a plot. There is something wrong with the world. In terms of the excess in the body, again, they've succeeded because it's projected outside in the other. It's the other that has this excessive energy that is persecuting them. And as for the question of distance, the paranoid subject is very, very clear in distinguishing him or herself from the other. I am innocent and the other is guilty. It's a very good way of separating self from other. So an example would be that, let's take two extremes. Someone who knows what's wrong with the world and gives themselves a place of innocence, or the one who's going to change things, they might see what's wrong with the world as being incarnated by the government or MI5 or the CIA, and in very rare cases there might actually be some conflict between them. It might lead to an act. But much more generally in paranoia, the person will identify what's wrong with the world with things that maybe a lot of people think are wrong, like an oil slick on the Mexican coast, or the fact that there's too much surveillance in our culture, or the fact that diabetes and cancer are terrible diseases that we need to find a cure for. And the person might spend their whole life working in scientific research or working for a charity. It's very, very common. All the great social reforms in society are made by paranoid people, by psychotic subjects. So they're never made by anyone else. It's absolutely true. If you look at the history of people who really believe in changing society and are willing to just go all the way down the line to changing this, you'll tend to find that it's a paranoid person, because they know that there's something wrong with the world, it's fixed for them, and they will then devote their life to trying to set it right. So again, one has to have a respect for paranoid subjects. And again, there's a question clinically, how one can help someone to find ways to work with rather than against the paranoia. Finally, melancholia, a very, very difficult thing to diagnose and to work with. Melancholic subject is someone, not who's kind of sad and, in the blues and all this, but someone who is absolutely certain that they are the cause of everything that's wrong in the world, that they are guilty, that they have a kind of ontological fault in them that nothing can eradicate. And they'll tend to broadcast this to people around them. Now, with the melancholic subject, the question of meaning, again, is solved. They are guilty. They have done everything wrong. They are the cause of all the sufferings in the family and the world around them. Meaning is solved. The question of excess saturate, of the surplus in the body, is in a way resolved because it's there submerging their own ego. There's a terrible suffering, a terrible agitation, which can often lead the person to take their own life. And the question of distance, in a way, is resolved because the person, rather than separating the self from the other that we have in paranoia, in a sense, they become the other. The one that they most hate is, in a sense, absorbed into their own self-image. And so rather than hating the other, they hate themselves. Now, so the three main motifs of what a psychotic subject might do to have, a more livable life, meaning the excess in the body and distance, can then correlate with these three groups of psychoses, the schizophrenias, paranoia, and melancholia, in different ways, showing what's perhaps easier for some subjects and more difficult for others. But they give us important clues when, for those of you who are therapists, when we work with psychotic subjects, which directions to follow in our work. Always bearing in mind that those three problems have to be in some sense solved, or at least approached, for the person to have more of a stability in their life, to be able to have some kind of bearable existence. Those three problems have to be thought about, reckoned with, tackled in some kind of way. Yeah? Now, when you then look at what happens in the weeks after a psychosis triggers, assuming it does, again, most cases will never trigger, but in the cases where it does trigger, you'll see that psychotic subjects' behavior, for want of a better word, tends to fall into, again, two main groups. The person will either try and add something to the world, or they will try to subtract something from the world. Adding something to the world could be knowledge. The person suddenly starts to do some scientific research, some mathematical research, some genealogical research, some research into what MI5 is doing, all the different things, some research into what cancer or diabetes are about. It could be anything. Yeah? The person is creating something at the level of knowledge, and sometimes they might actually create an object. They might invent something. They might actually come with an invention. Yeah? They might try and build something, literally, in the everyday sense of the word. On the level of subtraction, the person might try and remove something from their body or from the world around them. It could be, in an extreme case, by cutting off a part of the body, a finger, a toe, cutting the arm or the wrist. It could be through removing something from a public place, always a public place, a supermarket, a department store, a library, through theft. Yeah? Again, theft can be something very therapeutic, which you can only encourage for some people, because it allows them to treat the problem of there being too much in the world, things being too omnipresent and too invasive. By removing something, you might find the possibility of opening up a minimal space where you might be able to situate your own existence. Yeah? Remember that in psychosis, there's very often the effort to create a personal space or personal position which is livable. And sometimes it fits in very well with the expectations of society, and sometimes it doesn't. Yeah? But you'll always find this effort to create a personal position from which to do things, perhaps from which to speak. So I think I've given you an idea of the two senses of working with psychosis, the work of psychosis and how we might then learn from that in therapeutic work with psychosis. So two quite different things. What position could a therapist take here? And again, obviously this is a huge topic, and there are lots of different elements and experiences and so on. But if you don't mind me being a little bit reductive, just think about one thought-provoking idea, again from early psychiatry. The idea that the clinician, the therapist, working with psychosis has to adopt not the position of a master or a boss or an expert, but the position of a secretary, what they called in the early 20th century secretary of the alienated subject. What does a secretary do? Well, a secretary is someone who takes notes often, who listens, who every now and again asks to hear a word repeated. This kind of secretary would be interested in what they're doing. It wouldn't just seem like a kind of 9-to-5 job. They'd sometimes ask the person to explain something, to reiterate something, to perhaps to change something in a small way. They wouldn't classically try and impose their own view of reality on their boss. Yeah? It would be a much more discreet position, more like a witness in the traditional sense of the word, someone who's there to authenticate another person's experience, perhaps every now and again, as a very, very, very rare occurrence, to broadcast forcibly one's own views, or to tell their boss that they're wrong about something. Yeah, every now and again, perhaps very, very rarely. But it's more of a work of punctuating, of breaking up time. What did you say? Say that again, explain, and so on. It's very different from the position of experts that, again, in a lot of, though thankfully not all, contemporary culture, we find being valorized. With the idea that, now you've got experts about everything. So, if anything happens in today's world, let's say there's a bomb somewhere, you can't just accept the fact that people will obviously be traumatized by the bomb. You have to get an expert on TV to say, yes, the people were obviously traumatized by the bomb. And that's it. We live in a culture where experts are wheeled out to say what everyone knows. Is a bit like the kind of Greek chorus that they tell us what we need to feel when we see a play. It's very different in therapeutic work, where our aim is not to be an expert, because the real expert is, of course, the person you're working with, the person who's had the experiences, who knows something, who hopefully you can learn from the work that they've done in their own psychosis, to learn from that, and then perhaps, rather than to assume that we can help the person or tell them what to do or what not to do, that we can simply find a way of being of use to them and to enabling them to go further on the work that their psychosis has put them on. Let's stop that.